you. Thank you for the introduction. It's good to be here. And I am absolutely thrilled to be joined today by the fabulous Dame Vivian Hunt. Now, ever since she was a child, Vivian wanted to have a career that would improve lives. So after earning her degree at Harvard, she spent 2 years in Senegal working as a Peace Corps midwife. Fast forward to today, and she is the managing partner for UK and Ireland at McKinsey, and also takes such pride in her role as the chair of Teach First, amongst so many other things that she does. She's led pioneering work tying together inclusion and diversity to strong financial performance, and that's work that's been recognized globally. And it's this work, as well as her views on what's happening in the world today, that I want to talk to her about. So welcome, Vivian.
Thank you, Nicola. It's very good to see you, and welcome. Thank you for having me at CogX. It's good to see and be with all of you virtually.
It's good to see you. So let's get to it. Race is very much in the headlines at the moment. How's it made you feel to see what's been happening in the US and other parts of the world, including, of course, what's been happening here in the UK?
At a personal level, Nicola, I'm a mother of 2 Black boys. My boys are 14 and 16. And, I wouldn't be anything less than candid if I didn't tell you that you observed the continuing racial equality and the horrific murder of George Floyd and the many other examples that came last week that just lit a touch paper, a fuse, particularly amongst young people, but all of us. And so as a parent and as a mother, I, of course, want to inform, educate, and protect my boys, inform, educate, protect our organization, and not be cynical or weary that this moment's going to pass. I do feel that the scale and breadth of the injustice and the reaction feels different this time. And I hope for all of us it genuinely is. We have a chance to have a really new dialogue about equality and inclusion, and we have to seize the moment.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And McKinsey has just been launching some new research looking into the business case for inclusion and diversity. What do you think are the key takeaways that we should all be paying attention to?
The report Diversity Wins is really our 5th year looking quite unashamedly at the impact of gender, ethnicity, and race on performance. We started from which organizations perform well and said, what characteristics do they have? And the first thing that we've talked about many times, but it bears repeating, particularly given the COVID as well as equality and justice cries we're hearing, is that more diverse organizations perform better, whether that's cognitive diversity, representational diversity, gender, ethnicity, experience. They make better decisions and they perform better. And so, yes, that case has been shown and debated before, but this 5-year data set really proves it again. The second big takeaway is that organizations can make a lot of progress from where they are right now. Over 1/3 of the companies in the data set have made significant improvements in a more representative and inclusive environments. And that's really important because a lot of the technology sector is the fastest growth sector and most value creating. And for founders, it gives you an opportunity to choose and co-create the kind of company you want. And if you make those choices, it's correlated with faster growth and higher performance, and you'll see the outcomes. But 1/3 is not the majority. 2/3 of companies are still, we say resting on their laurels or not making enough progress. But the good news is if you're serious about it, either as a founder or an existing company, you can make progress.
Okay.
And the last point, Nicola, really relates to the previous comment about the environment we're in and the real strength of allyship and reaction to the, just to racial injustice sparked by the repeat of events in the US. And is that it's really the first quantitative look of how inclusion and inclusive environment is also correlated with performance, and that it's not the same thing as diversity. How we behave and experience each other in a business context and treat each other on teams is not just the same as having a representation around the table. And so we look at that, including using some pretty cool analytic techniques and data scrapes, et cetera, to show that experience and inclusion is just as important as representation.
Yeah, so let me just pick up on that last point around inclusion a bit, because I think one of the really important parts of the research, especially around the inclusion point and during the coronavirus pandemic, is that actually that the whole aspect of both diversity and inclusion is going to fall to the bottom of the priority list. Is this something you're already seeing happening?
Well, I don't think any company, 90% of companies claim that diversity and inclusion is high on their agenda. And all of us, if we're looking at the start of a company or doing something new, founding it, you want to start with those principles in mind. But saying it and doing it are really two different things. And when you're in a battle for your business and trying to fight to hold your employees, find the capital, really serve your customers, it's easy for it to fall down the agenda. What I would say is if it's built in to your business objectives at the start, if you're founding a company, or it's already included in the fabric of your business and objectives, then it's easy to reinforce. If it's not there, you need to add it. And this moment of recovering from COVID, even before we add the lens of addressing Black Lives Matter and racial inequality, just addressing COVID properly means you're looking at vulnerable jobs and underrepresented populations. So I look at it this way. If it's already built in to your founder's logic or already built into the culture of your company, you have a really unique opportunity to improve it. And if it's not built in, it's an add and a fix. So no one's actively rejecting it, but we've got so much to do that if it's not right in your top 3 priorities, like anything today, it won't happen. And so that's really, what the report urges companies to do, because it really still is the right thing to do, but it's also correlated with better performance.
Yeah, and that's something that all managers, all leaders of organizations can take it upon themselves to look at the research, to learn from it, and then to act upon it as well. But there is some
team by team, Nicola. Most of us, the CEO or the head of EMA, those feel really distant. You want them to be motivational, inspirational, ethical people, but really it's your manager, right? It's or the team that you might be, building your product or your first customer, right? It's the team you're working with immediately. And the practices can apply, from the C-suite right through to the everyday working team.
Yeah, I agree. And we shouldn't, any of us, be sat here waiting for a CEO to decree what to do. It's on all of us to make a difference. Because there is some really depressing research to show that minority communities are being worse affected by the pandemic. What do you think needs to be done to prevent particular groups from being disproportionately affected?
We need to be pretty unapologetic about the data. Sometimes looking at the data, at the history of representation for Black and BAME communities in the UK and right around the world is hard to read, because the data really shows a pattern of systemic discrimination and exclusion. But we have to start by knowing what the data is, because to address it, you can't just look at jobs and employment as one thing. You do need stable, good quality jobs. Half of the jobs that are furloughed in the UK, as an example, pay under £10 an hour. So you've got to really look at really good quality jobs and employment. But there are also a number of other factors: educational access, social access, health status, and access to health. And of course, your ability to have adequate and balanced representation in legal and other processes. And if you don't fix some of those social factors, Nicola, a business or a founding company can do a lot, but you have to be in an environment where good things can happen. And frankly, Black, brown, and other underrepresented groups can flourish. So as companies, particularly when we're in a time where many leaders, as founders and heads of companies, are really trying to be bold in their response. I've never seen a response to the health, economic, and human rights crisis that we're having now. True sincerity on the part of leaders, true sincerity on the part of individuals who want to educate themselves and be allies. But you really do have to link it to what you're doing within the business, and make it actionable and concrete. So it's easy to say, like everything, but harder to do.
Okay, so I want to get into what some of the actions could look like, because actually, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, 2/3 of companies are not moving, or they're stalling altogether. So what actually needs to be done? There's thousands of people listening to this conversation now. What are the actionable and concrete steps that people can actually go out and take? Almost a to-do list. What's 3 things that people can go out and do now, tomorrow?
The first thing is to really look at your hiring, recruitment, and promotion practices. If you don't have a systematic way to debias and attract diverse talent, diversity from all dimensions, but certainly including Black and ethnic minority talent, and certainly including women, if it's a system as opposed to just an anecdotal approach, you're not going to make progress. So recruiting, development, and promotion. Who do you hire? Who do you promote? That is an acid test of how decisions in your company get made. Leadership appointments within that are probably the single most important thing. But one leader without a system supporting them is tokenism or symbolic and typically not effective. Companies have to get to 30%, 40% diversity before that comes through. So that is for sure step one. Two, figure out what adds value in your business and why diversity matters to that. If you look at some companies like UPS or other distribution companies, they look at their supplier base and they link diversity to their supplier base because the distribution and collaboration of their partnerships, Amazon's another great example, really matters to how their customers add value and how they deliver for their stakeholders, never mind their shareholders within that. And so look at what your business does to add value and say, how does diversity matters? Yes, in pounds and p, dollars and cents, to what we do as a business. It can't be separate. And if you don't have a good, clear answer from your customer base, your suppliers, or your employees, you're not really sure what you're solving for. What adds value and why does diversity matter to that? And third and finally is inclusion. It's not just hiring people or having a diverse customer set. It's what experience people have when they interact with you as a person and as a company. And are you living up to that? And that's the disconnect and the dissonance many people feel when they're working in a company, is that they say the right things, they might have the training, but their day-to-day experience isn't there. So the hiring and promotion, particularly leadership roles, a value driver that links to what your business does that is reflective of diversity and inclusion, and finally, inclusive practices. It's how we behave and engage with each other. It's not just who we represent around the table.
And do you have examples of companies that have embraced all that you're just talking about, almost like the shining stars? And is that related to what you're seeing in terms of business performance as well?
We call them the diversity leaders. And these are companies that 5 years ago in this particular data set were already at higher levels of representation, and in the last 5 years have been able to increase representation and increase inclusive programs. And that's about 20% of the data set. Many others have made great improvements from a low base, but about a third of companies, Nicola, because I give companies a lot of credit for improved performance, even if you're starting from a low base. About a third of companies would fall into that. But there are some companies like BHP Billiton, which have done a fantastic job at modernizing, adding analytics and tech skills, diversifying on gender and inclusion, and also tailoring to their local communities. Healthcare companies like GSK and Johnson & Johnson, who have really worked on allies programs and including the male population just as much as, for example, the female population. UPS, who has been really an Amazon, which are both great examples of supplier and partnership participations. I'm really keen, and this is why I think CogX is such an important forum, that if you look at where value creation is going, where the companies are being built, where new ideas are going, the entire world, as this conversation on Zoom and CogX virtually demonstrates, is going to be on platforms. And so the companies that own the platforms, tech infrastructure, software, services, the enabling capabilities that the CogX forum brings together are so important, because you are today's and the future business platform. And if those things are built into how we work in that new platform, then you really have a chance of embedding and improving it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And are you seeing any practices in the US that's different to what's going on in the UK, and any shared learnings that can go across the pond?
Well, the U.S. has a little bit of a head start that has been talking about and measuring diversity for a slightly longer period of time. It's had a history of affirmative action, particularly in places like education and in the workforce. Obviously, we know that the data tells us we're not where we need to be, but it does mean that they have a deeper and richer data set, and it's also legal to ask people about their background, for example, on hiring, so it's just easier to identify cohorts. But to be honest with you, there's no magic formula, and you wouldn't be seeing the disproportionate positive results for more diverse organizations, and the pain and anguish in this cry for more racial equality and social justice if any country were ahead. What I would say is your company that you're either building or the company that you're working in can have improved and better practices. And what are you doing to put those things in place? There's lots of good practice and examples here. We don't have to invent a new solution. Just use those best practices in your company.
Now, you've been involved in this work for a very long time. When you first started, and I'm looking for lessons learned that can be maybe applied for other people that are thinking, actually, I want to do something, I want to get involved. How easy was it for you in the beginning to start to kind of amplify the work that you wanted to do and to take people on the journey with you?
You know, Nicola, I'll be honest to say that when we started looking at gender, ethnic diversity, and other forms of multivariate diversity, LGBTQ plus, different ethnicities within countries, multi-ethnicities within places like Malaysia, India, different social experience and economic cohorts, even within the UK, that wasn't the intention. But what became clear was that many groups, including, women, 50% of the population, to take the most obvious one, were being left behind. And it was rate limiting us in terms of our economic growth. It was rate limiting us in terms of our cultural growth and our connection as businesses and as people. And you couldn't really solve the problems of performance in businesses unless you did it in a more inclusive way. I started out like most young people start out, Nicola. I didn't want to talk about culture, ethnicity, diversity. You don't want to be labeled, right, as the person who's just talking about diversity and inclusion and not what the core business stands for. But what I've learned over time and being a little wiser than I was before and more global is that if we don't address these issues at the same time, we don't build the right businesses for the future. And the data backs that up. And so that gave me more courage with my voice to combine improved business performance at a time when we urgently need it, coming out of COVID, coming out of a health crisis, responding to a cry for more justice in the world, that we have to have the courage of our convictions and the evidence of the data to speak up. So now the two things are very complementary. There's not a gap between the two for me anymore. But when I started out, I needed to find, you sort of need to find a way to combine what you're doing, building your business or your business purpose with these principles. And fortunately, the data backs up that the two things really are very tightly related. But I had to take the time, even as an old professional, to find my voice.
Now, there's a lot of people listening today. CogX is really about also celebrating startups. And you touched briefly on founders and, when people are thinking about setting up what the practices and values and culture matters to their organization. What advice would you have for all those startup founders, both big and small, that are listening today, based on what we've been talking about?
Build in the operating principles for a more diverse, inclusive business from the start. If you're a startup founder in the first year or two of your business, you and your startup team, your initial funding group, should sit down and make choices about what kind of company that you want to be. How does it add value to your business? And how are you going to reflect that in the company's norms? And it is not an accident when you look at the great superstar, global successful tech and platform players, they have a point of view. Salesforce comes to mind. They have strengthened their point of view. Facebook comes to mind. They're having to make more choices, both because the big macro changes, even when we have a vaccine and we're past COVID, Nicola, the big macro changes happening in the world relate to technology enablement of our entire society and the long-term climate change impact of the world we live in. Those are much longer cycle changes. And the decisions you make in your startup phase are the ones you're going to live with when you're in your scale-up phase. And so decide now that it's part of your principles and be tough on yourself. Do we have a diverse team, or are we playing into the bro tech stereotype? Do we have leadership roles and diversity in our funding? Have we looked broadly enough, and are we holding ourselves to a high standard? Do we know why diversity and inclusion matters in our customer base or with our suppliers? Are we using an ethical frame for who we work with? I mean, it's just yes or no. And you, as startups, have the ability to make those decisions. And don't think it's just for the big tech companies of the world. You're the ones that are going to be the Facebooks and big platform players of tomorrow. And so make those decisions now, and you'll build a better company.
Cool. I love that sort of strategic checklist, which, just taking the time to think through right at the beginning can make such a difference in terms of the size of company. Now, we're being flooded with questions from people, so let me try and get to as many as I can quickly. Question, how do you think the current protests around Black Lives Matter is affecting CEOs on a global basis? And do you see companies changing over the next few years?
Well, I think it's hitting CEOs and companies at both a personal as well as institutional level. I think at a personal level, particularly for people who are not Black or Afro-Caribbean, there is a new level of insight and realization. It's why the range of example that we saw caught so plainly on video, from a horrific murder in the case of George Floyd, all the way through to the casual cloak of privilege that the Cooper video suggests, of just not, even without your own knowing, putting on the privilege of being a white female and able to use race, ethnicity against another person so easily. I don't think people saw themselves in either of any of the examples that we saw, but I think what they saw was how deeply ingrained bias and racism is in our culture, even from the most well-meaning person all the way through to the person whose motives may not be as well-meaning. And so personally, I think a lot of people have just said, I need to be more educated. I need to read more deeply about understanding the impact of privilege. I need to consult and ask my Black and BAME colleagues and friends what they're going through, so that I can be a better and more informed person, but also importantly, a more informed leader. Dozens of your colleagues and employees and friends are out there protesting peacefully in the streets. And if you're going to do anything to lead your organization, you need to be aware yourself, not woke in some cliche or trendy way, but genuinely educated so that you can make a change. That's the first thing. There's a personal awakening and a responsibility to not be neutral. We are against racism and bias. We are for inclusion. And that is a shift in the business context. And I think it's a terrific shift. And I'm glad all of those commitments are also on video so that we can hold ourselves accountable to them.
I agree. A question from Sandra. You mentioned bias in the hiring process. Can you give examples of this and examples of how they've been overcome?
Bias is often invisible. And so when you look at your recruitment and hiring patterns, some of us have seen the classic examples of when you anonymize the name and ethnicity, gender of resumes, when you have analytic tests and recruiting so that it's not as influenced by individual judgments and frames, when you have a group decision making on hiring and advancement as opposed to a small concentrated, when you're criteria based. There are things that sound like basics to some companies, but when you're starting a company, you can use best practices and tools to make sure that you've got a structured framework and that you do actively de-bias your core processes. For McKinsey, we concentrate a lot on recruiting and developing fantastic people and having great client service and pioneering and bold leadership views. And we have standards and metrics and criteria for how we do it. We're by no means perfect. I'm sure there's lots of improvement and more inclusive environment that we can build. But my point is just to say, you've got to use data, use criteria-based processes, review them every year. We train on inclusive leadership and hiring practices every single year. It's not something that's one and done. And consistently working on this, and I've just used recruiting as an example, whatever process you choose, it's the best way to be vigilant about having a more objective and inclusive environment.
Question here about startups. In startups, most of the time it's about getting the right hire and not actually having the time to focus on diversity, as getting the right individual is key. I sort of apprehensive even saying that to you because I think I probably know what you're going to share as the answer, but they're not mutually exclusive, are they?
They're not, and it's a great question. But what it means is you're going to have to look different places and with different sources. So very often when you're building up a skill set or trying to grow rapidly, or you need a specific set of skills, the first thing I would do is look at the profile of the team. And then as you add each person and each profile, because you're hiring on probably tech experience, network, financial, a whole range of skills, but you also have to look at gender, ethnic and cultural diversity, and also diversity of lived experience, all within your mix. Some of those are intrinsic attributes. I happen to be a Black woman. It doesn't necessarily make me more qualified for my job, but I also have a range of professional experiences. So if you absolutely can't find anyone who adds more diversity of experience and representation to your mix, you need to have a broader pool. and you need to start your searches earlier, and you need to keep looking. Have the courage to wait until you find that broader pool of talented people. The second thing is use networks. This is an online platform. Really use your networks in broader circles to find people, because a lot of people hire based on recommendation and people they come across in their network. And if you have a broader network, you'll come across a broader range of profiles.
Great. Vivian, we're almost running out of time, and there's so many questions flooding in about thanking you for these useful insights, about how you need to build those values in at the beginning. So I can see that you're inspiring lots of people to want to take what you've literally just said and apply it to their own businesses. And I didn't get to talk to you about the fantastic contribution you made to the Facebook book, Make It Work. So we didn't even get to talk about the advice that you've got for women wanting to make their mark, which we can share and make sure that people can check out that chapter after, because I think what you shared there, and it's certainly around the lack of visible female role models in business, was some really inspiring and really practical. Again, you're always very practical in what you share. But I do have time for a very quick fire round, which, as you know, is a Facebook tradition. So just say what comes into your mind. First question, early bird or night owl?
Ooh, early bird for sure.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
I knew that. Your lockdown guilty pleasure? Coffee, yeah.
My husband. Time alone for the two of us is enough. He's been my guilty pleasure for many years.
The one thing you've learned about yourself since working from home?
I need sunlight. I'm not getting a lot of it now, but I need sunlight. Sunlight and vitamin D is a really good thing.
The best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Be true to yourself.
And finally, bookworm or phone scroller?
Ooh, girl. It's changing because all the books are online now. So I guess that makes me a phone scroller.
I got you. But I love a book, I have to say. I'm nothing beats.
But it's on my Kindle or on my iPad or on my computer. So I guess I'm a scroller. I'm a little bit of both.
Vivian, it has been amazing to speak to you. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions out there. It has been a privilege to be able to spend this time together, to learn as ever from you, to be inspired from you, and just to say thank you for being here today, Nicola, with all of us. Back to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Vivian. That was a fantastic session here on the Global Leadership Stage at CogX 2020. That brings this session to a close. Thank you both, and we'll be back soon.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.